Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to module number 2. And this week, I want us to begin really diving into, it's one of the more profound arguments in philosophy that has really never been resolved. And honestly, the more our current age becomes deeper and deeper steeped into scientific discovery and scientific reasoning, the more confusing it is for us to consider this question of free will. In science, the view of the world, the view of the cosmos, is very materialistic, meaning that all that there is somehow physical and material. Where in philosophy, philosophers tend to look at those fundamental questions of being in a way that is not solely about the material world. And so physics is really this field of study that is really lending argument and strength to the idea that nothing is ever freely caused. In other words, there is always a predetermined cause for all things. And that idea, that way of thinking, bleeds over into human thinking and the idea of free will, that we may imagine that we have chosen something freely to do, or that we have choices of our own making, but determinism says that's just a mistake. We imagine that we have free will, but ultimately we don't, because there is always some previous cause or series of events that have caused this particular moment to occur. So we really don't have free will. Well, this is a debate in philosophy, and it's important for us because the human condition really, honestly requires some sort of free choice. If we are not free to choose our actions, in other words, if there is always some outside determining cause, whether it's an immediate cause or perhaps a series of events over time that has led to this moment, then the fundamental moral question is, are we responsible for our choices? This is a dilemma that philosophy really wrestles with. And Stephen Kahn actually helps us think through that quite well by giving us some examples of case history in the legal courts. That, the person may be guilty by law, but are they morally responsible for their crime if all actions are predetermined? Okay, so I hope that you've already read Kahn's arguments here and his description of those problems. But I want to walk us through a few definitions today. I want us to walk through what it means, or how do we as philosophers define free will? How do we define determinism, and some of the problems there in those definitions, because I think it'll help you in wrestling through this problem. I'm also wanting to show you a few quotes from some great philosophers over the centuries about this question. Okay, so let's dive right in. Okay, so here we are. The free will problem. What is the free will problem? The free will problem is really a moral problem. So this is where philosophy comes in. This is a question of ethics. Are we responsible for our actions if we are determined beings? I don't know about you, but if I got into trouble as a kid and I understood the fact or this idea of determinism, man, I wish I'd had this arsenal when I was talking to my parents and they caught me with my hand in the cookie jar, or if I was making a mess somewhere. Oh, I can't be blamed. I'm not at fault. Someone else did it, or something else made me do it. Right? That's a common response here. And so this is the moral problem that we call the free will problem. And so here's the power of what we think is self-determination. Do we have the right, or do we have the power to determine ourself, to determine our actions? If we possess free will, some of our choices are not decided for us, but are up to us to determine. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's a fundamental That's a fundamental right of being human. It's part of what makes us human, that we do have choices of our own. Do we have the ability to determine our own destiny, our own choices, our own outcomes? If we do not possess free will, let me move this over here real quick. If we do not possess free will, then our social and political freedoms would only seem to be considerably less value. Why is this the issue? Okay, that's what we got to worry about. Because if we do have free will, we can determine our actions freely. But then when we do that, we're also morally responsible for those. But if we do not possess free will, our social and political freedoms would be less valuable. Do we really have freedom? The value that we place upon freedom would be diminished if we do not possess free will. So here's how we define this, okay? The free will problem. How do we define determinism? Determinism is the philosophical idea that every event is determined or necessitated by preceding events and the laws of nature. This is where a lot of physics arguments come in. Everything that is material, and that is all things, is predetermined, and the movement or the actions of that thing is already necessitated by previous events and the laws of nature. So in determinism, we have to say, are all of our actions produced by a chain of events that stretch back into the indefinite past? Or do we have free will in the present, unaffected by these other things? Determinism, here's some of the problems here. Since every cause always results in the same effect, the future can unfold in only one way. So determinism is not just looking into the past, it's also an argument of inference that if everything has occurred this way in the past, we can conclude that in the future, this chain of events will continue in the same path. So therefore, we cannot alter the future, we cannot alter the path of the chain of events. That's at the root of determinism. So if that's the case, everything that happens must happen in an unalterable, predetermined manner, and we cannot change it. Here's the other way to think about determinism. If determinism is true, are any of our actions or choices really our own? Here's the fundamental philosophical question. If we are predetermined, if all of our actions and our thoughts and our ideas are influenced to the point that what we do must happen a particular way and in a particular time, can we say that our actions are really our own? If determinism is true, how was your attendance in watching this video and being a part of this course determined? Did you freely choose to do this today? Or were there chains of events that happened before? If determinism is true, how can our actions really be free? Here's some of the questions that determinism brings up. So here, now we've got to look at the free will problem in relation to determinism. The challenge here is of reconciling determinism with our intuitions or ideas about our personal freedom. I mean, I don't know about you, but I like my personal freedom. I like the idea that I can get up in the morning and choose how my day goes. I mean, there are events that are outside of our control, but fundamentally, we like the idea that we have the freedom to determine how our day proceeds. There are three subset arguments in determinism, and these are going to be defined just a little bit differently than the way Kant defines them in the philosophical adventures, and I'll try to walk you through some of these. There is hard determinism, there is incompatibilism, and then there is indeterminism. And let's define these three ideas of determinism. Hard determinism. This is an absolute solid position that no one has free will. Absolutely not. If you think you have free will, it's a mirage. So the argument here is broken down this way. Determinism is true. Determinism and free will are incompatible. So therefore, we never act freely. That's the argument from hard determinism. And this raises a moral question, doesn't it? Just a second. Here we go. I'm sorry. Let me go back. There we go. Here at the bottom, if you can see this, here is the fundamental problem. Here's the fundamental problem. The murderer or a child molester who is guilty of a crime, if hard determinism is true, this criminal is not guilty or responsible for their actions because their environment predetermined their personality, their choices, their emotions, etc. And Stephen Kahn really walked this through very well at the beginning of part 2. When you read the case there on pages 29 through 30, actually 31, it's the Darrow case. The defendants of Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold, and they were guilty of murder, but their lawyer, Clarence Darrow, used this argument of hard determinism to say, well, we can't avoid the fact that this horrible event occurred, but the argument shifted to not whether the crime occurred, but the responsibility for the crime. And he successfully argued that these wealthy kids were not responsible for their crime because of the predetermined circumstances of their childhood and their livelihood. It won. I mean, that case won. These kids were convicted and they were sent away, but morally, the case said they're not morally responsible. And that's the result of hard determinism. Now, I don't know about you, but I find a problem with that. Many people, I think, would have a problem with that. So this now becomes this paradox and this tension. Well, can we ever be responsible and free for our choices? So let's go a little bit deeper. What is incompatibilism? Here's the second definition here that we need to determine here. Incompatibilism. It says that no one can act freely. This goes a little bit deeper than hard determinism. No one can act freely. Here's the argument. Determinism and free will are incompatible. There's no way that we can be free in our choices and all actions be determined. There's a logical conflict here. So if that's the case, they both cannot be true. This goes into the logical argument of the law of non-contradiction, that you cannot have A and B at the same time and both be true. A or not A means that either A is true or not A is true, and both cannot be at the same time. So determinism and free will are incompatible. They both cannot be true. If every event is determined, there can be no free will. And if free will exists, determinism cannot be actual. So we've got a logical conflict here in incompatibilism that incompatibilism sees. There's a logical conflict between determined actions and free will choice actions. They both cannot be true at the same time. So therefore, one or the other must be true. Indeterminism says that not every event is predetermined. Logically, it goes down to this point. Not every event is predetermined. Here's the thing. Many events, let's think about it. Many events are uncaused. And quantum physics does help us. It's starting to break down the tension here in the arguments between determinism and free will. And again, here in Philosophical Adventures, Kahn does touch on some of this. The advances of quantum physics does give some evidence that not all action in the subatomic level are caused by preceding force. So this idea in physics that all that exists is material, the deeper that physicists explore and study atoms and submolecules, they're realizing that not every molecule, not every ounce of materialism is predetermined in its motion. It's blowing everybody's mind. So it's taking the previous arguments that used to be presented and really twisting them and turning them around a little bit, showing that some of the previous ideas on determinism were not necessarily valid. So let's take a look at this. Here is the place where I am. Compatibilism, or what Kahn defines as soft determinism. Both terms mean the same thing, and I will mostly use the term compatibilism as Stephen Kahn speaks of soft determinism. And it argues that both determinism and free will exist. So determinism is true. We cannot avoid the fact that there can be, and there really is, a series of previous events that lead to the current time that affect our current event. But then at the same time, determinism and free will are compatible because sometimes we do act freely. And so here's the idea that both determinism and free will can be true at the same time, and somehow they are compatible. And me personally, as a philosopher, even as a theologian, I mean, I am a Southern Baptist pastor as well. This is where I fall. Because this question of determinism and free will also plays into religious discussions, and we're going to be talking about religious philosophy here next week in the next module. And so this idea is going to come into there as well. Are all things predetermined, or do we act freely? I think they're both. There's room to argue that both are true. Both can be true. I guess the deeper questions then, at what level are they true? And the argument here in compatibilism is, although determinism is true, our actions can still be free because determinism and free will are not in conflict. Now, this is another area of that many philosophers over the centuries have thought about. And I think this is more the agreed position than hard determinism or incompatibilism. Compatibilism says that individual action is free under these conditions if the action is caused by our own choices or desires. And so here's where desires and beliefs come into the play in determinism and free will, just as Kahn has mentioned in his text. If the action is caused by our own choices or desires, the action is not impeded or constrained by anything. That means the individual action is free under these two conditions. If the action is not stopped or hindered by any other force, and if the action is caused by our own choices or desires, then free will must exist. Here's the argument. Criticism of compatibilism argues that actions determined by desire without constraints is not real freedom if your desires are determined for you in the first place. Right? So here's some criticism of compatibilism, that actions determined by desire without constraints is not real freedom. That's a different argument. Okay, what does that mean? You could say that desire is the predetermined cause of why you want to do what you want to do freely. Maybe you're not really freely desiring it because your desires are forcing you to choose it. I think that's a different argument. I'm not sure if I fully agree with it, but that's the criticism. Here is, let me just introduce a little bit about, let me introduce just a little bit here of some of the previous ancient philosophers on this. Plato is an ancient philosopher who had some ideas on free will. And here's what he had to say. Socrates concluded in this. We've not really touched on this, so let me touch in here. Plato and Socrates can be considered maybe one and the same, while at the same time being two people, because Plato was a student of Socrates. And so when you read Plato's writings, he's writing about Socrates, and we're going to probably dive into some of that. So when we talk about Socrates, we're talking about what Plato has written about him. There's a dialogue written by Plato called the Protagoras, and you're welcome to look that up if you wish. And here's what he says. In this dialogue, actions are entirely determined by our beliefs of what is the good. Okay, here comes the moral question. Actions are entirely determined by our beliefs of what is the good, and our beliefs of what is the good is determined by our knowledge, our understanding of the world. In other words, we cannot act against our knowledge of how we should act, and so our actions are determined entirely by our knowledge. In other words, what Plato is arguing about free will is that our knowledge directs our choices. What we understand, what we know, then determines what choices we make. Aristotle says this. He was a philosopher that came after Plato. Aristotle was actually one of Plato's students, but Aristotle actually went beyond Plato's influence, and we'll be looking at some of his work, especially when it relates to ethics and logic. In Aristotle, he has a work called the Nicomachean Ethics, and Aristotle was not a determinist. Plato tended to be more of a determinist, that knowledge determines our actions, that we really don't have free will. But Aristotle disagreed. He says that there are some events that happen by chance, in a sense inconsistent with their cause. Let me say this again. He thought that some events happen by chance, that in a way that is inconsistent with whatever previous cause determined it. So therefore, he argued that free will might happen. Aristotle does entertain what is called a restricted determinism, and here's what he means by that. Restricted determinism, again, you read about this in the Nicomachean Ethics, and I encourage you, if you're interested, to look it up. It's a wonderful read. Here's what he says. Here's a quote. The saying that no one is voluntarily wicked nor involuntarily happy seems to be partly false and partly true. Almost seems like a compatibilist argument. So restricted determinism might be more of a compatibilist argument. He continues to say, for no one is involuntarily happy, but wickedness is voluntary. Okay, so here we go back into the moral question. Anyone who chooses bad action, immoral action, according to Aristotle, it's a voluntary choice. But to say that no one is voluntarily wicked nor involuntarily happy seems to be partly false and partly true. Aristotle argued that in order to be good, in order to be moral, you needed to practice morality and be affected by those who were already moral. They would influence your morality. However, he argued that if you were to do evil, wickedness, then that was a voluntary choice, that you weren't necessarily influenced by others, that you just did it on your own. So in other words, to be good, it almost seems like Aristotle said you need some predetermined influence. But in order to be wicked, we're already there, so we're happily wicked, he said. So that's an interesting argument from Aristotle. Let's continue to see what else he has to say here. Again, about restricted determinism, here's another quote. He says, to the unjust and to the self-indulgent man, it was open at the beginning not to become men of this kind, and so they are unjust and self-indulgent voluntarily. Now, here's the highlighted part. But now that they have become so, it is not possible for them not to be so. So once you become self-indulgent and unjust, then it's difficult. In other words, very impossible almost to get out of that way of living moral, or being immoral, I should say. Now, John Locke, we'll go through this quickly. John Locke had some ideas here as well. His idea is called thoughts of custom. It's in a work called Concerning Human Understanding. He said there is another connection of ideas wholly owing to chance or custom. So here's where he's arguing that events can be random, and they are by chance. Here's what he says about thoughts of custom. As far as we can comprehend thinking thus, ideas seem to be produced in our minds, or if they are not, this may serve to explain their following one another in an habitual train. Habitual train sounds like a train of events, like determinism, when once they are put in their track, as well as it does to explain such motions of the body. It's interesting that Locke thinks this way. Ideas seem to be this way, but Locke argued for what is called the tabula rasa. It's the idea of the blank slate. We are born with a mind that has no predetermined or pre-instilled sense of knowledge or understanding. So it would seem like John Locke would argue that all of our choices are of our own, that nothing is predetermined. But it seems here he's arguing that ideas seem to be on this habitual train that leads to our actions. But let's go deeper and see what he says about the liberty of the will, because John Locke wrote a lot about the liberty of someone's will. Here's what he says. That willing or volition being an action, and let me define, volition is the power of using one's will. So here's where I think he's arguing for the power of the will. Here's what he says. That willing or volition being an action, and freedom consisting in a power of acting or not acting, when any action in his power is once proposed to his thoughts as presently to be done, cannot be free. See, here's where when I'm reading Locke, I'm confused here, because he argues in his epistemology that no knowledge is pre-instilled in us. There's no such thing as innate knowledge. We build our knowledge as we go. Okay. Let's look at William James, and we'll kind of close up here with him. William James was a more contemporary philosopher in the late 1900s, early 20th century. And here's what he argued. I'm sorry, the late 19th century, early 20th century. And here's what William James argued. He says, it professes that those parts of the universe already laid down absolutely appoint and decree what the other parts shall be. So he's arguing, he's defining determinism here. This is the dilemma of determinism. And he's going to come up with a pretty different answer here for these events that seem to be appointed and decreed on what will be. Here's what he says. Here's how he defines indeterminism. Indeterminism, on the contrary, says that the parts have a certain amount of loose play on one another, so that the laying down of one of them does not necessarily determine what the others will be. And he continues to define, again, indeterminism. He says, indeterminism thus denies the world to be one unbending unit of fact. So here's where James is now laying out the argument that determinism, it seems to be flawed. Seems to be a little bit flawed here. So he's laying out the dilemma that determinism brings. Because if indeterminism is true, it denies the world to be one unbending unit of fact. Is the world bendable? Is the world changeable? Can anything change? That's the dilemma here of determinism. So here's where William James concludes that determinism fails. He says this, determinism, in denying that anything else can be in its stead, virtually defines the universe as a place in which what ought to be is impossible. In other words, as an organism whose constitution is afflicted with the incurable taint and irremediable flaw. Here's the problem with determinism, according to William James. It looks at the universe as a place that seems to be impossible. In other words, everything is so determined and so ordered and so in a chain of events that cannot alter. It denies the fact that the world and the universe in it, especially living beings are organisms that are flexible and fluid. We are not these machines that are robots. And that's basically what William James is arguing here as the failure of determinism. Determinism, he says, violates my sense of moral reality through and through. So again, the failure of determinism, time and again, can be seen in morality. When we start arguing moral ideas, determinism fails. So, here's where William James concludes with what he called pragmatism. Okay, this is not in your textbook. This is just a little extra for you to think some of these things through. So, pragmatically, he argues that determinism can't happen. The pragmatic method is primarily a method of settling metaphysical disputes that otherwise might be indeterminable. The pragmatic method in such cases is trying to interpret each notion by tracing its respective practical consequences. Okay, so pragmatically, determinism just doesn't work. The pragmatic method interprets each idea by tracing its respective, what are the practical outcome? What's the practical consequence of thinking about determinism? Practically, determinism falls apart because then we have to admit that we are not machines. We are not on this track of just doing things like robots. That's basically what William James was saying. So pragmatically, determinism doesn't work. He says our beliefs are really rules for action. So what we believe what we believe does affect our action, but they are rules for our action, not predetermined absolute causes of our action. He says to develop a thought's meaning, we need only determine what conduct is fitted to produce. Practically, what will the outcome be of this belief system that causes my action? What's the outcome here? That's how he works through that. He says all questions of alternative viewpoints must be considered through the filtered question, and here's how you can think through determinism. What do the outcomes promise? So this is a consequential way of looking at determinism and free will. What is the outcome of our action? That will define whether the action was predetermined or freely chosen. And if we look at the consequences, do consequences then affect our choice? I think so. Here's what else he says. He says, free will pragmatically means novelties in the world, the right to expect that in its deepest elements, as well as in its surface phenomena, the future may not identically repeat and imitate the past. So, pragmatism, according to William James, by looking at the logical outcome or consequences of a choice, must fall under free will, not predetermined events. All right, so let's close with one more quote here from William James and we'll move on. Here's what he says. Free will thus has no meaning unless it has a doctrine of relief. In other words, free will has to exist if there is a relief from predetermined trappings. So for William James, it was more important to him, the important freedom to free oneself from custom, remember, free oneself from predetermined actions, or the trappings of the past, is more important to James than a determined destiny. So for William James, pragmatically, free will made more sense than predetermined destiny. So here is one area in the free will problem that I think we need to make sure we define. Fate. Sometimes determinism and free will are confused with the concept of fate. So let's take a look here at this. Fate. What is fate? It's an ancient idea, but is fate the same thing as determinism? Fate is the antagonist of freedom, it's been called. If you are destined by fate, then you have no freedom of choice. The Oedipus complex that the Crash Course Philosophy videos will introduce you to, the ancient story of the Oedipus trilogy. It's a tragedy that Oedipus thought he was freely choosing to avoid a fate, but despite his efforts, all of his choices led to the fate eventually. Oedipus is doomed to kill his father and marry his mother. I mean, watch that video from Crash Course Philosophy if you're not familiar with the Oedipus problem, and you'll see kind of the dilemma here that fate brings. But is fate the same thing as what is determined? That's what we have to figure out. Fate. What is fate? The ancient mind did not doubt that men could choose and through choice exercise some control over their lives. Here's what Tacitus says. Most men cannot part from the belief that each person's future is fixed from his very birth. You may be thinking that as well, but here's the fundamental philosophical problem. The wisest of the ancients argued that said, leave us the capacity of choosing our life. So even ancient philosophers, as they were wrestling with the idea of fate, they could not get away from the desire of the human condition to choose one's life. Here is what Augustine of Hippo argued. He was a Christian philosopher, theologian, a bishop of the church, and here's what he argues this because he points out that we can, when we're thinking about that which is predetermined, predestined, maybe we're confusing that with fate. And he wants to argue here that there's something at play here that we need to remember. Here's what he says in his work, The City of God. In a word, human kingdoms are established by divine providence. And if anyone attributes their existence to fate, because he calls the will or the power of God itself by the name of fate, let him keep his opinion, but correct his language. What that means is that Augustine saw the confusion in Western thinking between the language of determinism or predestination and the ancient mind of fate. The two seem to be similar, but Augustine is arguing they are not. And Augustine argued for the position of compatibilism, really. He was a soft determinist. He said, fate is often thought in connection with astrology. The position of the stars at one's birth determine one's life direction. But here is an example he gives in his argument that helps us think, well, astrology and predetermined fate and destiny kind of breaks down when you have people born on the same day under the same sign. Here's what he argues. If the position of stars determine fate of a newborn, especially newborn twins, and if twins are born under the same celestial circumstances, think about this, the same sign on the same day, usually within minutes of one another, are these twins destined to the same fate? Matter of fact, twins share much of the same DNA. So if fate and predetermined lives are the way of living, then you could argue that twins would have both the same fate, wouldn't you? Well, clearly they don't. And here's a little insight for you. I am a twin. I have a twin brother. And my brother and I are as opposite as day and night. Really. So I think Augustine's illustration here does have some credibility here to the idea that no one's life is predetermined absolutely, because twins clearly break that mold, don't they? Lastly, Thomas Aquinas, he brings out the idea of fate versus providence. Okay, this is another form of Christian thinking and philosophy. He says, fate is a disposition inherent to changeable things by which providence connects each one with its proper order. But he says this, fate is not identified with providence but made subordinate to it. The distinction depends on the way we consider the ordering of effects by God. Keep all of these in mind as we go into the next module, Module 3, and start looking at philosophy and faith. When we look at religious belief, this idea of determinism and free will is really going to play out in the arguments of Christian thinking and philosophy as it relates there to religious thought. Okay, so thank you for your patience in going through this nearly 37 minute little mini lecture. It may be a lot, but I think it's important to help walk you through some other ideas other than what you see in the textbook and what you're seeing in the videos. Fundamentally, I want to close out with this idea. When we're thinking about determinism versus free will, are we mistaking determinism with fate? Are we mistaking the idea that all things are predetermined, all causes affect us in ways outside of our control? I think if you were honest in thinking through this, we do have control over many of the events in our lives, but we don't have full control. I think so. We have to agree that there are predetermined causes that affect our actions, our choices. But then at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that we do have free will to choose, especially when we talk about moral action. We are responsible for the choices we make, good or bad. We can't get away from that reality either. So let me encourage you to now dive into the discussion forum after watching even the crash course videos that I have there for you, and even the Closer to Truth video that I have listed for you. That'll give you an interview with another philosopher as they walk through these problems as well. And I look forward to reading your discussion posts, and I want to interact with you this week on that. Is free will and determinism compatible? Now, you don't have to come to the same conclusion I do, that compatibilism is the better conclusion to this debate or this argument.